Good morning. Have you settled down? Finally, we will begin talking about something that you hear perhaps the most often in our country, issues related to the open economy, that is, our dealings with the rest of the world. What are our dealings with the rest of the world? Are we a relatively open economy, a relatively closed economy? How do we know? So that's a good question, right? How do we know what we take from the rest of the world, what we give, what happens? Okay, so one way to think of this would be the percent of, as a percent of GDP, what? Exports and imports. That would be one measure. What else? So is it just exports and imports? Balance of trade. What is the balance of trade? The difference between exports and imports. Okay. What else? So the first thing we have to do is we have to have our statistics right. We have to know where to look. Foreign currency. What we look at is what is called the balance of payments. Do you know what this is called in Turkish? Ödemeler dengesi. This is published by the central bank. And you should look it up. In fact, we have time, maybe we can look it up together. The balance of payments comes in two parts, 2.5 parts. On the one side, we have the current account. Do you know what this is in Turkish? Cari hesap. In fact, when you have a deficit on this side, it's called cari açık. Okay? This is something that you hear very, very, very often. Memleketimizin cari işlemler açığı, car 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 cur cur cur. Türkiye'deki cari açık, car 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 cur cur cur. That's where this number is coming from. Okay? The current account has, right, so the current account is is where we record what we take from the rest of the world and what we give to the rest of the world. All right? Except for assets. So immediately you can see that we would have exports of goods and imports of goods, right? This is your trade balance. Normally, we're very careful in saying goods and services, right? This is goods. Why is that? So how do we export something? Physically, how do you export something? Yeah, you put it on a truck, you send it out. Okay? Can you put a haircut on a truck and send it out? Can we export services? So we have to decide. Goods, you could see, right? You can take Turkish hazelnuts, those are goods, put them on a truck, put them on a plane, put them on a ship, send them out, right? And then the Japanese and the Germans and the French will eat them. That's good. That's exports. Similarly, goods enter our country. Somebody ships them. That's also okay. What about services? Are they exportable, importable things? Can you send a truckload of massages out? Aha, masseuse. Yes. But we're not looking at the movement of people, right? People stay where they are. People who provide the goods and services stay where they are. Yes, ma'am?
Service means service consisting of people. The main tool of the service.
Like what?
Like haircut.
Okay.
You cannot have haircut without
The barber.
yeah.
Okay.
So if you, for example, import a haircut,
Mm-hmm.
you can call from another country.
A barber.
The barber will come.
That's called immigration, right? That's not the movement of goods and services. For your information, we don't sell people, right? So it is true that people who provide these services can move around. That is right. But we don't record the movement of people in the balance of payments. That would be rude to begin with, right? You wouldn't want to be lumped with potatoes, I guess. And it goes counter to the thinking, right? You know, does our country receive income when we sell a barber to, England? I hope not. That would be slavery. Okay? So are there no services that we sell to the rest of the world?
Customer support. Like United Kingdom does that. When you call customer support, you actually get routed to India.
Okay, so that would be one. So for our country, there's a huge one. Tourism. You have to ask yourself, look, do we have a trade balance? Do we have balanced trade, a trade surplus, or a trade deficit? We have a huge deficit, okay? Our country, and we're going to talk about this, our country in general has large trade deficits in trade of goods. Our current account deficit, however, is always smaller than this. One important reason is our services balance is always positive. All right, so exports of services and imports of services. So for Turkey, this item is a deficit. That means we receive from the rest of the world more than we sell to the rest of the world. All right? This item is always a positive. And the big reason is tourism. We receive a lot more tourism revenue than we spend, right? We are a country of sea, sand, and the sun. People flock into here, right? And we get income from that. You have to ask yourself, we know that we don't send out enough potatoes to cover our, this is the potato sending out. We don't send out enough potatoes to cover our purchases of French wine. That's the imports, okay? But then how are we able to buy this wine? Right? What this says is, well, partly this is because we provide tourism services. Okay? So the French give us wine, we let them use our sand and sea. Okay, what else? So these things are usually complicated. We have very good ways of recording all of our foreign transactions, so they're very detailed. This is the largest item. This is the second largest item. And then there are a zillion more items. Usually you can lump these under two headings. One is net investment income. It's not the net investment itself, it's the net investment income. All right? Net investment income is, do Turks own factories in Romania? Yes, many. Do these people still live in Turkey? Or do they have relatives in Turkey? Are these Turkish companies that happen to have factories in Romania? Yes. So they do production in Romania. Is that our export? No. You're right, no it isn't. It's not our export, because exports means something is produced in this country and then sent out, right? If you produce in Romania and sell it to the Romanians, it's not an export. But when that company makes profit, do these people usually keep their profits in Romania or send it back to Turkey? We don't know, right? I mean, it's not like, oh, they always do this, they always do that. But we know that at least part of it is sent to Turkey, because the person who bought this factory is doing the operation in Romania, who's living in Turkey, right? Is doing this because that person wants to do consumption, do investment, something, use that income. And the person is living in Turkey. That income will be used in Turkey. It somehow has to come to Turkey. Okay? So somebody wires, 2 million liras, the profits of this factory in Romania, to Turkey. So suddenly we have this 2 million liras of purchasing power coming to our country. Now, why is this purchasing power coming to Turkey? Did we export something? Good? No. Did we export services? No. Right? So where does this appear? It's the net investment income. Okay? This item is important for countries that either have a lot of foreign investors or have a lot of investors who own foreign holdings. For example, Hungary, after the early 1990s, privatized a lot of its state holdings. And in fact, everything was state-owned, right? These are the ex-communist countries. Then they were called the transition economies. And what they were transitioning from was some form of communism to a market capitalism. Now, that means you're going to have private ownership of the means of production. Those things are being privatized. Who is buying these? Many of them were bought by foreigners. Now you have the foreigners owning your factories. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I mean, the usual Turkish reflex is to say, oh, that's horrible that the foreigners are buying our stuff. Yeah, I don't know whether it's a bad thing or a good thing. Okay? But one result of that is, once your factories are producing and they're generating income, do Hungarian workers receive wages? Yes. Is that a bad thing? That's a good thing. Okay. Work is being done in Hungary. These are all good things. But in the end, when the company makes a profit, does the parent company want to receive that profit from Hungary? Yes. So the investment being the factory itself, somebody bought that factory, invested in that factory. Okay? The investment income is the profit of that factory. That will be sent to Japan, because this was a Japanese person who had bought that factory. Okay? Is this a dealing with the rest of the world? Sure. We have to record this, right? What this is saying is, look, Hungary has to send this investment income to the rest of the world. That means some of the Hungarian potatoes will go out. Okay? Once again, it's important to think of these in terms of potatoes and not in terms of money. You export potatoes, you import potatoes. Okay? Services obviously aren't potatoes, but the idea is something that you provide, something that you produce is sold to foreigners, okay, goes out, or something that the foreigners produce comes into you. Net investment income is something that we produced, okay, but the foreigners have a right on this. What this says is, as the Hungarian factories produce and make profits, foreigners are entitled to more Hungarian potatoes. Okay? We're going to talk in a minute why this is important. The other one is net transfer income. This is a small item. Net transfer income is somebody gives you a gift, okay, or you give somebody a gift. There are other items. I'm not going to tell you all of them because I want you to look it up. Okay, it's going to be in your homework. And there are always these interesting questions about, okay, so if X, Y, Z happens, where is this recorded? For example, Turkey says we're going to give you an amnesty if you have undeclared income outside the country and you bring it to Turkey. Okay? We did this very recently. If you have undeclared income outside the country and you bring this to Turkey, we're not going to charge you a penalty. So people suddenly say, okay, here's $1 billion liras, and you're going to see this appearing in a Turkish bank. Is this in the balance of payments? Sure. I mean, it's some income, some money that comes from the rest of the world, right? Suddenly you see a Swiss bank wiring $1 billion liras to a Turkish bank, $1 billion. Okay? It has to appear somewhere, but where? Think about this. How about our workers who work in Germany and who send money to their little old mothers who are in Turkey? Is that here? It has to be, right? It's a claim on German potatoes. Somebody works, creates potatoes in Germany, and then tells his mom, I'm giving you the right to buy these potatoes. Somehow we have to see that transaction. Now, the question is, if we add all of these up, do we have to get 0? Should our net trade balance, net services balance, net investment income, and net transfer income, when we add them up, give us a 0? Okay, that's good. It does not have to. It could be 0, it could be positive, it could be negative. Well, what does it mean? If it's a negative, it's called a current account deficit, cari açık. Well, that immediately tells you that it doesn't have to be 0 because you've never heard Turkey have a current account balance, right? This isn't entirely right, actually. Now, we're going to do two things. We'll first talk about why the current account does not have to be in balance and what it means when it's not in balance, okay? Then we will talk about, well, what is on the other side of this, okay? If we're in a deficit here, we're taking more than we're giving to the rest of the world. But something has to balance this. The current account itself may not be in balance, but surely the rest of the world isn't just telling us, here we are giving you potatoes. That's it, right? If this is in a deficit, it means we are receiving more potatoes than we are giving. Is it that the rest of the world are saying, we love the Turks, let's give them some potatoes? That isn't usually how the world works. Now, when we think of trade, we could think of trade in two ways. One is, at a point in time, different countries produce different goods, and they exchange these goods. So, goods and services, right? Turkey is very good in providing sun, sea, and sand. So we provide this. And Germany is very good in providing cars. We get cars in return. Is this trade? Sure. The value of the tourism services that we provide to the Germans is equal to the value of the cars that we receive from Germany. Right? Is everybody happier? Sure, right? We're driving good cars, Germans see some sun, we're all happy. Now, another way of thinking about trade is trade across time. This will be the following way of thinking, and this is very, very important that you understand this. I could say, look, as a country, it turns out we didn't produce much this year. Why? Who knows? It was a bad year. Should we go hungry? Or should we say, we can turn to, I don't know, Greece and say, you had a great year. You had a ton of produce. Why don't you give us some of yours? Do we have anything to give in return? By definition, we don't. It was a bad year. We didn't produce much. But can we give them something next year? So we could trade over time. All right? A current account deficit means you're trading over time and you're borrowing today. You're receiving more from the rest of the world, more goods and services from the rest of the world than you're providing them. Is this a bad thing? All right, so you're all saying, yes, yes, but you're saying this because you're almost conditioned to say this. Why do you think it's a bad thing? I mean, if you read the newspapers and see the little people talking on TV, they all talk about the current account deficit is large, this is terrible, blah, 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 but why? Did you ever borrow from a friend? Yes. Was it terrible?
No, but there's a burden.
Okay. But you knew that there would be a burden, right, when you borrowed?
But it can be payable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not my account.
Okay, good. This is exactly the spirit. So the point here is, when you're borrowing, and you know that you'll be able to pay it back, it's good to borrow. In fact, it's good to be able to borrow. You should understand this. The current account deficit doesn't materialize because some central planner in Turkey, the prime minister, sits down and says, this is not a very good year, we should borrow from the rest of the world, so therefore, as a country, we decide that we will have a current account deficit. It happens because of the collective action of all of us. Our country, throughout the history of the Republic, had current account deficits, and large ones, except in crisis years. So what happens to us is, in good years, we have large current account deficits. In bad years, we have small current account deficits or surpluses. The last time we had a current account surplus was in 2001. Okay, and 2001 was a terrible, terrible year. So why is this happening? Let's think of yourselves. Are you guys producing any goods and services? Do you guys produce any value added? Do you use anything? Yes, I see that you're all, clothed. That's a good thing. You seem well fed. You seem to have slept under a shelter, right? So you are using goods and services, but you are not producing any. How is this possible? Your parents are providing for you, okay? That's easy. Now, the relationship between you and your parents isn't one of trade. But we could push it and think of it that way. You're effectively borrowing from your parents. But how are you able to do this? Can you pay this back? Ana baba hakkı ödenmez yavrum. That's not what I'm asking. Will you always be using other people's income to have clothing and food and shelter? No. I'm very happy to hear that. So what's going to happen? You will work. When you work, you will produce a value added. Will that value added cover what you have borrowed from others so far? If it won't, there's a window. Jump out right now. What is happening to productivity in our country? It is increasing. If productivity is increasing, do we think that we will be richer people in the future than we are today? Yes. This is easy. Now, this is where things get not tricky, but you have to pay a little attention here. Here's the question. How do you behave if you think that you will have more income in the future than you do today? The good example to figure this out is to say, do you have any money in your pocket? How did you get it? This is the answer I'm going to get from all of you, right? Your parents gave it to you. Do you have any money in your pocket? How did you get it? Your parents gave it to you. Do your parents give you money every day? Or once a week? It's once a week. All right. So you get your weekly allowance from your mom on a Monday morning, right? And then it turns out that you spent a lot this week. You spend it all away. So now it's Saturday, everybody's going out, and you have no money. Are you not going to go out? Would you ask her for a loan? Maybe. Okay, would you ask him for a loan?
Yeah.
Yes. Fair. So how can you ask him for a loan? Can you pay it back?
Yes.
How?
My future income.
On Monday, his mom is going to give him his allowance again. Then you can pay him back. So what he's saying is, look, on a Saturday, I find myself in a situation of, I don't have anything today, I'd like to spend, okay? And I know that I have future income. On Monday, I will have income. So he says, I want to begin spending Monday's income 2 days before. Does this make sense? This is one of the most important things economists assume about human nature. And in general, we are right-ish in this assumption. That is, people don't like to have consumption paths that jump around. When you ask people, would you rather have a feast today and then go hungry the day after, and then have a feast the next day and then go hungry the day after? Or would you rather have, slightly less than average but decent meal every day? Which one would you like? Okay? Everybody says, I'd like the second. That means I am willing to pay something to to get rid of this jump in my consumption. Okay? I'm not giving you the average of the feast and hunger, right? I'm not giving you the average meal. I'm giving you a slightly less than average meal, and you're happy to take that. Just so that you're not, eating a lot hungry, right? That's bad. You have studied enough economics, so you're going to understand this. People like to have smooth marginal utilities. You don't want your marginal utility to jump around. For that reason, he's saying that on Monday, today is the Saturday, I know that I will have income on Monday. I could eat all of that income on Monday, but I don't want to, because that means I will have a high consumption on Monday, a low marginal utility. On Saturday, I have no income. If I'm able to spend a little, marginal utility will be very high. Okay, so I'd like to balance these. I'd like to spend some of my Monday's income before I receive it. Good. Now we understand this at a level of, one university student who is allocating his allowance. Now let's think of this on a broader scale. Let's think of your lifetime. Today your income is effectively zero. But 4 years down the road, you will all be working and at high wages because you will be high productivity individuals. You know that 4 years down the road, you will have a high income and a high spending potential. Do you want to begin to spend that today? Well, you already are. Okay? However, is it only you who will have a higher income 4 years down the road? If the productivity in the country as a whole is increasing, will everybody be better off? Yes. So not every single person, but the average guy will be better off. Okay? Does everyone want to begin to spend future income today? If it's correct for this one guy over these 3 days, it is correct for the average guy over 4 years. Right? If you understand that, look, this year was a bad year. It's bad compared to how it will be 4 years down the road. And I'd like to buy a new car. Should I buy a new car? If I'm sufficiently convinced that 4 years down the road I will have enough income to pay back a loan that I get for a car with interest, will I buy the car? Sure. Here comes the question. Well, who lends to me? I want to borrow because I think that 4 years down the road, my productivity will be higher. I'll be teaching a more efficient 102 lecture. The university will be teaching me more, will be paying me more. All of you think that you will no longer be students. You will have high incomes. So, you go out, you eat, drink, make merry, as you should, right? But the whole country thinks this way. Everybody wants to borrow and spend future income. Who lends to us? Now you immediately see the point. We cannot be doing this within the country, right? Within a country, we can't have an equilibrium where everybody borrows. Somebody has to lend, okay? In a closed economy, this will lead to the interest rates increasing. Everybody wants to borrow. Available funds become more valuable. Interest rates increase. We decide not to borrow. That'll be the end of it. In an open economy, can we borrow from the rest of the world? Yes. What is it that we're borrowing? How do we see that we have borrowed from the rest of the world? Remember, why did I want to borrow? I wanted to buy a car. Okay? But we don't have enough income today. Right? What does that mean? We're not producing that car today. Therefore, the income of the production of that car hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen 4 years down the road, 10 years down the road. Okay? So what I'm saying is I'd like to spend more than I produce today. And you all are saying we'd like to spend more than we produce today. Can a country's spending be higher than its production? In an open economy, sure. We could turn to the Germans and say, can we eat some of your potatoes? Can we use some of the cars that you produced? and give you nothing in return today, but promise to pay you further down the road. Can we do this? What happens if we do that? We have a current account deficit. That's what a current account deficit is. Okay? As a country, what we're saying is we expect our country to do better 4 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. Therefore, we want to begin to do investment today. We want to begin to do consumption today. But we can't do it because by definition, we don't have enough production to cover that investment and cover that consumption. If the Germans are willing to lend us, are we going to borrow from them? Sure. The next question then is, well, are the Germans willing to lend us? So Germany here isn't a random example, right? Germany has a large current account surplus. And you must see that in the world, if this thing is measured correctly, the current account surplus countries' total surplus and the current account deficit countries' total deficit must be exactly equal, right? Because if I'm producing less than what I use, somebody has to be producing that difference. Somebody has to be using less than they produce. That should wash out. Germany has a large current account surplus. China has a huge current account surplus. In fact, it's sometimes said that the rest of the world has a current account deficit because China wants to have a current account surplus. Okay? But let's think about Turkey and Germany now. The average Turk is saying, I will have more income 10 years from now, so I'd like to begin using that income today. Okay? We expect our incomes to increase. That means we are this saving today. The Germans are saving. The Germans are saying, we're going to produce a lot, but we're not going to use a lot. We're going to lend, we're going to save. Okay? Now, if each German wants to save, they have a lot of loanable funds. But if everybody wants to save, who's going to borrow this? That's us. Okay? We borrow. Why do the Germans want to save so much? Western Europe in general is saving a lot. Why is that? Mumble, mumble, what?
It turns out to be an investment.
Of course, yes. This is the bad usage of investment though. Okay? So they are saving, but they are not investing. We are investing their savings, right? Germans are saving, but that turns into investment in Turkey. Why? So we owe the Germans. We will pay them in the future. The question is, why is it that the Germans want to do it this way?
Because the population gets old.
That's exactly why. The Germans are getting old. Now, the average Turk, as you well know, is a young guy or a girl. Young people expect to receive more income as they age. You're more likely to be employed. If you're employed, you're going to get more on-the-job training, right? You're going to have a higher human capital, higher productivity, higher incomes. That's us. The average German is some guy or some woman who has been working for a long time, who is a person of very high human capital already, therefore has a very high income. But when you ask this person, where do you think you will be 15 years from now? What is the answer? Retired. If you have a very high income today, and if you're nearing retirement, do you want your consumption to fall the day you retire? Are you going to spend all of your income? you will be saving. That is, you're very productive because, right, so in your productivity profile, you're at a very high point. You've accumulated enormous amounts of human capital, okay? You produce a lot, you're very productive, therefore you get a lot of income. But you don't want to spend all of that income. You want to save. You want to save for retirement. That's for two reasons. One, it's the retirement itself. And two, life expectancy is getting longer and longer. You expect to live as a retired person for a long time. Do you have the funds to do that comfortably? Well, to have that, you will save. Is this 1 German or 5 Germans or 10 Germans? Or is this the average German who is behaving this way? That's the average German. But if the average German wants to save, who's going to borrow? That would be us. Okay? That's why this works so well. For each country, for a country that has a current account deficit, you have to have someone who is willing to have a corresponding current account surplus. Okay? So there are a handful of countries that have huge current account surpluses. Germany, Japan, China. Okay? Germany and Japan, you immediately understand. These are countries that are getting old. China is very hard to understand because it's a young population and these are poor people getting richer. Right? The average Chinese is much poorer than the average Turk. Their income is rising faster than Turkey's income. That's your convergence. Okay? Now the question is, well, why isn't China behaving the way Turkey is? Why is it that China has a current account surplus while Turkey has a deficit? That's a great question. If you remind me on Wednesday or next week, we'll talk about that. Okay? To talk about that, we have to first talk about exchange rates and related things. So we said we have a current account deficit. That means we're borrowing from our future. When you say it that way, it sounds worse, right? That's his point of borrowing is good so long as you're able to pay it back. But now you must understand why Turkey always has a current account deficit. Throughout the history of the Republic, did we think that the country is going to get better? Did we think that we're going to catch up with muasır medeniyetler? Right? Does it mean that we'll be richer in the future? So in 1940, we thought we'd be richer in 1960, right? In 1980, we thought that we'd be richer in 1995. In 2010, we're thinking that we'll be richer in 2020, okay? So you borrow. In 2000, did we think that things will be much better 2 years down the road or 10 years down the road? Yes, we were in a stabilization program. Inflation was falling. We were being told, you know, this is the time we're going to make it. So in 2000, the current account deficit goes through the roof. What happens in 2001? We have the crisis. When you have a crisis, do you want to have a current account surplus or a current account deficit? Let's think of it. In a crisis, is your income expanding or contracting? If your income contracts, are you poorer today or are you richer today? When you're poorer, do you want to borrow or do you want to lend to other people? So do you want to have a current account deficit or a surplus? But we had a surplus. Why? No one would lend us. Okay? That's the problem with current account deficits. If you're able to choose when you pay it back, right? If the plan works, if your mother actually gives you your allowance on Monday morning, it's great. If your mother tells you, you know what, today I decided that you're old enough, just go work, earn your own income. Do you still owe this guy? Well, you borrowed from him on Saturday. That no won't do. He's about to smack you on the head. You see my point, right? The time when you really want to borrow is the really bad day. When you had the crisis, you want to have a current account deficit. Well, you cannot borrow. In fact, that's why you had the crisis. So let's talk about the other side of this. The other side is a financial account. That's the part that says, look, I've been recording these transactions in goods and services. You're getting German cars and French wine and not giving anything in return in terms of goods and services, right? It can't be that these guys are just, ask me. Financial account. It can't be that these guys are just sending us stuff. Okay? There has to be something that goes out in return. What goes out? In a financial account, we're going to record the flip side of this. We observe more imports of goods than exports of goods. We observe more exports of services than imports of goods, but that's not enough to cover this. These are relatively small items for Turkey compared to these. Thus, we're left with a current account deficit. That means we have borrowed from the rest of the world. If I borrow from the bank, my balance sheet says cash on one side, right? But it also says debt to the bank, right? Or the bank's balance sheet has a loan to me. That's a transaction. I have to have something similar here. If I'm not giving the rest of the world goods and services, I have to be giving them assets. That is a right on my future income. All right? And that's in that sense, most likely, unknowingly, the German who is saving is actually helping investment in Turkey. The financial account has two large items. One is portfolio investment. The other one is foreign direct investment. Here's what these are. Let's say we export, import nothing. So our balance of payment is a sheet of zeros. And then I say, I want to buy a bottle of French wine. How does this work? I go to the French winery and say, why don't you export a bottle of wine to Turkey? I buy that. Is that going to be here? Yes. So now we have a current account deficit. Do I have to pay this guy? Yes. How can I pay this guy? Somehow I have to borrow from the rest of the world. I could buy from the guy himself. Right? I could tell him, this bottle of wine costed 25 euros. Here's a piece of paper that says, I will pay you 25 euros in 2 years' time. Can I do this? If the French wine seller is willing to do this, sure, why not? But now, somebody has a piece of paper that says, someone in Turkey owes me 25 euros to be paid in 2 years' time. Did I sell something? I effectively sold that piece of paper and bought the wine in return. Okay? That's portfolio investment for the French guy. That guy is saying, I have a receivable from Turkey. Somebody in Turkey owes me. I want you to understand, more than this specific transaction, I want you to understand that if we have a current account deficit, that means the income we generate by selling goods and services is less than the worth of the goods and services that we buy. Okay? The difference has to come from somewhere. We must be borrowing the difference somehow. Right? This isn't something that's immediate to most people, so let's talk about this once again. Let's think of the example of the French wine again. I buy a bottle of the French wine, but I don't have the income. So in what ways can I pay this guy? Somehow I have to get 25 euros. The guy says, look, I'm more than happy to export this bottle of wine to Turkey, but this is a 25 euro bottle of wine. You have to pay me 25 euros. How do I get 25 euros? I could say I'm going to borrow from the bank. Can I borrow from a Turkish bank? Yes, but no. Because this is what we talked about earlier, right? Since nobody in Turkey is selling anything abroad, that 25 euros doesn't have an income counterpart in Turkey. Think about the current account deficit as a whole. It says everybody wants to borrow. Can everyone borrow from the banks? It's an obvious no, because you now understand that the bank has to borrow from someone. The bank that doesn't create income. The bank doesn't create money. Can the bank borrow from foreigners? Can Garanti Bankası go to Deutsche Bank and say, I want to borrow €1 billion from you? Yes. That has to be in the financial account, right? Effectively, what's going on is Garanti Bankası is borrowing from the rest of the world so that I can borrow from Garanti Bankası and buy that bottle of wine. What if that doesn't happen? Can the Turkish government borrow from the rest of the world? Sure. When the Turkish government borrows, does it know whether it's borrowing from Turks or foreigners? So sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Because the government says, here I'm selling government bonds. Who's buying them? Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. But if we are not saving as a country, and the Turkish government is borrowing, can we be lending the Turkish government? We said the people in Turkey don't like to save because they think that they'll be richer in the future. But the government says, I want to borrow. To lend to someone, you have to save first. If we aren't saving, but the government is borrowing, where is that money coming from? The government, you have to see that the government's budget deficit, right, must be related to this current account deficit. Because the government has deficits, because the government is using more resources than it collects taxes for, the difference has to come from somewhere. Right? We're going to make this more formal. What else? How else can we do this? Could I say to the French guy, look, I run a wine shop in Ankara. Okay? What I want you to do is to send me so many bottles of French wine. In return, I will give you 10% of the shares of my company. Can I do that? Yes. Is this borrowing? This is tricky, right? So it's not borrowing in the sense I have to pay something back, right? But it is borrowing in the sense that, well, this guy now has a share in my company, and if I make a profit, I have to pay this guy 10% of the profits. He owns parts of the company. That's what foreign direct investment is. Foreign direct investment is foreigners acquiring productive assets in our country. So if I privatize, say, Türk Telekom, and sell it to foreigners and get I forget now what the number is. Say get $1 billion in return. Okay? I'm saying, look, I received $1 billion, that's in the financial account, and therefore, now I can buy $1 billion worth of foreign goods and services. I sold them a company, and I could buy foreign potatoes with that money. Okay? The portfolio investment is thought of as a short-run item. That is, the people who have invested in your country, who have lent to your country in portfolio investment, can get rid of it rather quickly. Foreign direct investment is long-term, is a long-term affair. There's a rule of thumb to decide when something is a foreign direct investment versus when it is portfolio investment. Here's the question. Somebody comes to your country and says, I'm going to go to the Turkish stock market and buy, I don't know, 0.5% of Tepe Holding shares. Okay? Is this in the current account or the financial account? It's in the financial account. Is this portfolio investment or foreign direct investment? So this one we think of as portfolio investment because the thinking is if somebody is buying 0.5% of a company, these guys aren't in there to help this company grow faster. They are not going to take a management interest in the company. They have a tiny share. Okay? They just want to make a quick buck. Let me put it this way. If you bought 0.5% of Tepe Holding, can you decide 2 weeks from now that you don't want this anymore and just sell all of it? Sure. We list this in portfolio investment. Okay? But now let's think that somebody comes and buys half of the Tepe Holding. Okay? Now, is the intent of the guy who bought 0.5% versus 50% of the company the same? Will the guy who has 50% of the company go to the board meetings and think about the investment of this company and try to make sure that it's well run and all that? Is it easy to sell 50% of a company? That takes time. That's how we divide investment into portfolio investment versus foreign direct investment. Okay? If foreigners are buying Turkish debt, that is, if they are buying, say, Turkish government bonds, that's portfolio investment. They could sell those bonds anytime. Okay? If they are buying shares in Turkish companies, and those shares are less than 10% of the company, that's also portfolio investment. That 10% is an arbitrary number, but that's the number that everybody in the world uses. The idea is that if you're buying a small share in a company, you're not trying to get a stake in that company for the long term. Okay? That's portfolio investment. If you buy a large share in the company, you're saying, I want to run this company, I want to be there for a long time. That's foreign direct investment. Okay? Do we have a preference for one or the other? We bought, say, $2 billion worth of, or 2 billion euros worth of French wine. So now we know, and we exported nothing in return. Now we know that we have to receive either portfolio investment or foreign direct investment in the amount of 2 billion euros to cover this. Do we have a preference? Would we rather have portfolio investment or foreign direct investment? Portfolio investment is what people call hot money, sıcak para. It could go out anytime. If things in Turkey look bad, they're going to come to you and say, here is your debt security back. Here is your stocks back. I'm just dumping these, and I'm getting out. Effectively, they're saying, pay me now. Right? Do we want this to happen? Once again, think of 2001. 2001, the economy shrank. We also had a current account surplus. If we had a current account surplus, was our usage of our GDP equal to, less than, or more than the GDP? Compared to our production, which shrank itself, did we get to use all of that production? We now are the people living in Turkey. Or were we able to use more goods and services than that? Or did we have to sell the rest of the world? You know, we didn't produce much, but still, here's a slice of that pie. You get to eat this, and then we're going to share the rest. Which one? This is where it becomes clear whether you understand what a current account surplus means. In 2001, we had a current account surplus. Did we use all of our production? Were we happy that we didn't? Here we saved. In 2001, did we save or dissave? We saved. Did we want to save? That was a terrible year. Okay? In bad years, you want to use your savings. The problem is, in the good years before, we did not have savings. We were borrowing. So in the bad year, we were told, we're no longer going to lend you, and the amount that you have to pay back today, we're dumping your portfolio investment on you, right? Pay us back today. That's why this is called hot money. Okay? And that's why people are afraid of this. Foreign direct investment isn't as dumpable because somebody buys a factory in Turkey. Okay? Now, could that somebody want to get rid of that factory? Well, sure. I mean, if you buy a factory, you're not married to it for life, right? You may want to sell it. But if you can't find a buyer, can you sell it? No, that's the point, right? So the Turkish government borrows, say, at a 6-month maturity. At the end of the 6 months, it says, I want to borrow again, right? But it means every 6 months, your lenders decide, do I want to lend these guys again? Do I want to lend these guys again, right? In 2001, they said, no, we're not. Pay us back today, okay? Then you have to produce a current account surplus so that you can pay the guys back. That really hurts in a bad year. If instead of selling them government debt securities, we had sold them factories, could they have said, take your factory back and pay me? They can't force us to that, right? It only happens if they can find a buyer. On the other hand, then you complain, right? The Turkish factories are owned by foreigners, right? We privatize to foreigners. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. You get to think about that. So, is the distinction between foreign direct investment and portfolio investment clear to you? Okay? Here's the question. Let's say I bought that 25 € bottle of wine from the French winery. I have no exports. The rest of the current account is 0. And I don't have any portfolio investment or foreign direct investment either. Could this happen? The answer is yes. Once again, you have to think through time. Perhaps in the past, I had a lot of portfolio investment and foreign direct investment, and I didn't have much current account deficits. Is this possible? The Turkish government says, I'm going to borrow. Foreigners buy those debt securities. Okay? The Turkish people say, well, we don't want to have as large current account deficits. So a lot of foreign income is flowing into the country, but we're not using it. Can this happen? Where does that money go to? That goes to the central bank reserves. Okay? We're going to talk about this in more detail. So one last item here is, this is important, change in central bank reserves. What I could do is to say, here is the Turkish lira equivalent of 25 euros. Okay? I give that. I buy 25 euros. And I buy my French wine with that. Now, where did that 25 euros come from? The repository of foreign exchange is the central bank reserves. What must have happened is the central bank now has 25 euros less reserves. That's why it's the change. And in general, we think of it as the negative change. So what's happening? Let's say we had 30 billion euros worth of a current account deficit. Okay? So on this side, we know that the value of goods and services that flew into the country is $30 billion more than what we provided the rest of the world. On this side, what has to happen is that either we received exactly 30 billion euros in portfolio and foreign direct investment, then nothing happens. Or, let's say, we received nothing in portfolio and foreign direct investment. Then it means you have to be paying these guys back from your savings in the central bank. That's why it's a negative. Okay? The central bank reserves has to run down $30 billion. Do we have $30 billion in central bank reserves? We have 70. Okay? Our central bank's foreign reserves are $70 billion. Now do you understand why it's important we have reserves at the central bank? The question becomes, let's say something like 2001 happens again. Nobody wants to lend you. This is what's happening on the financial account. We still want to borrow. Can we borrow? If you have enough reserves at the central bank, yes, you can. If, like in 2001, you don't, then you have to produce a current account surplus. Okay? What else changed? In 2001, all of the financial account was in portfolio investment. Those guys could immediately say, pay us back, right? Now we've been attracting enormous amounts of foreign direct investment. That doesn't reverse as quickly, right? What happened in several years between 2001 and 2009 is Turkey was such a great investment opportunity for the rest of the world. Everybody wanted to enter our country, buy Turkish factories, blah, blah. We got enormous amounts of financial account surpluses. This was a huge positive, okay? So huge that we couldn't generate current account deficits as large. Foreigners want to lend us like crazy. We didn't want to buy foreign goods as much. What happens? Where does the difference go? Central bank reserves. Did the central bank reserves increase during this period? I just told you it did. That's why it did. Okay? Good. What I want you to do before Wednesday is go to the central bank's webpage. You're going to find this table for Turkey. Take a look at it. Okay? So that we have something to talk about on Wednesday. Excellent.